ever since I was a little kid, I thought that having a old-timey, vintage, movie star bathrobe would be the height of glamour and sophistication, and I always wanted one. A couple years ago, I found the perfect one online. It was the New York Gold Seal 1427 vintage pattern. And, as it happened, I just bought it. This is the story of making my own vintage robe. Let's go. So I ordered the pattern online from a company called So Vintage Pattern, and I paid way too much money for it, but I don't even care because legit, I've been trying to find this robe for almost 10 years online, and they had it and I couldn't believe it, and so I bought it. So let's take a look inside. So it's pretty much set up like a regular pattern that you might buy at the store today, with a couple of really significant differences because of how they made patterns back in the day. The first is that there's no markings on the pattern. The only markings that exist on the pattern are these weird like cutout dots that exist, but that's it. There's no numbers, no anything. So thankfully the pattern arrived already cut out, but basically what I wound up having to do was look at each pattern and then sort of like use the pattern guide as a map to figure out what piece that I was looking at, which in some cases was a lot harder than you might think. So the first thing we need to do is get some paper, which I have on this giant roll. Please take a minute to appreciate my incredible outfit. We're going to take some of this paper and we're going to really first appreciate this seamless and beautiful transition. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this giant piece of paper and we are going to trace out the pattern pieces, because some of the pattern pieces are in terrible condition, and as I was working they started falling apart. Like you can see, I'm taping some of the pattern pieces and the directions back together because they were just crumbling in my hands. So we're going to use this paper to create a viable pattern piece to work with. However, that got a little complicated later on, and so I'm basically just laying them out and figuring out what I've got. So one of the big problems with this pattern is that they had been in this bag for who knows how long, maybe even since the 1930s, and so a lot of the pattern pieces were really wrinkly. So I had to take a few minutes to very, very carefully iron and press out the actual piece of the pattern, so then that way I could get an accurate sort of read on the angles and what the pattern piece looked like. Now the ironic thing is that I actually wound up not even using this pattern piece when I cut everything out, because it was like an extraneous piece that you can sort of just figure out. It's for the strap on the robe, but it's a good example of how you do this, and I'm just working really slowly and really carefully. And also, if you're wondering why there's paint all over me, it's because I redid my deck this afternoon, so you're welcome. So this process took about 20 minutes just to get all of those edges for a piece that I didn't use. I'm still mad about it. But so basically, yeah, so I did that and it was ready to go, and now we're back to the table. And this is where kind of the fun, interesting part starts. Please notice my beautiful overhead shot. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to trace the pattern pieces. But the thing is I really didn't want to mess up the original pieces as best as I could. I wanted to preserve them. They belong in a museum. And so I basically decided what I was going to do is try and trace around them. So I took my very fancy Sharpie, you're welcome, and I started just sort of matching up the corners and tracing it that way. You can do it differently. You can, just draw straight lines all the way around. I just like to do the corners and go from there, especially when working with a pattern this delicate, because as you can see, like a lot of the corners just didn't exist and they were falling apart and they were tearing and ripping, and it was a big dumb problem. And so rather than trying to futz with tracing all the way around, I just decided that it would be a lot easier to kind of just do the corners, do some dashes here and there, and then join up, because at the end of the day most of these were like squares and circles and that kind of thing. So that is what I did. So the weird wooden circles you see are really lightweight pieces of wood that I use to weight down delicate pattern pieces. Sometimes if you put something heavy on one end of a pattern and then it shifts in the opposite direction, it can cause enough pull to tear. And so these pieces of wood have really smooth edges and they're pretty lightweight, but they're nice because they help to hold everything in place. So once I'm kind of happy with the shape of the pattern, I noticed that a lot of the patterns had weird punch holes on them in different places. Some of them had numbers, some of them just had random sort of little punch holes, which we'll get to later. But so then I traced those and I was pretty happy with my corners, and so I started tracing the actual shape of the pattern. For this one I used straight edge, and then I decided that I was a big kid and I didn't need to worry about it, so this is like the only time I'll use a straight edge in the entire video. But if you're new, you should probably do that. Don't be like me. You're gonna see terrible habits through a lot of this video, so you know, just do what's right for you. I'm bad at drawing squares, so I decided to use the straight edge for this piece. And this piece is just a mystery panel. I'm still not sure where it's gonna go, and I think the next part of the video talks about that a little bit. I was right. So basically the problem is that this piece had like a backwards upside down number on it, and I could not read it. And so I kept looking at the instructions and trying to figure out what piece it was and where it might go. And to the best I can figure out, I think it's that piece right there, but it's unclear as to where it actually goes on the garment. So I'm assuming we'll figure it out later in the build. Okay, so now we move on to what was probably the most complicated piece of the pattern to trace, which was the bodice, which I cleverly put onto the actual piece of paper upside down and sideways, which I don't recommend when you're trying to figure out how a garment goes together. But like I said earlier, the pattern was in such bad condition that honestly, with some of these pieces, it was really hard to tell which way was up. So you can see that I'm tracing some of those dots that I talked about earlier, and I'm so glad that I did because they wind up being a huge part of the build of this project. I had no idea. I thought maybe I should keep them, maybe not. But I just wasn't sure, and so I'm really glad that I kept them in there. Also at this point, your computer is not freezing up. I just super sped up the video, and so it's sort of chunked out. But basically I just keep tracing, and we're creating that bodice on the piece of paper, so then that way we can ultimately, you know, make the thing. Yup. Sometimes I run out of things to say before the clips are over. It's fine. Yeah. So now I'm just going through and I'm basically connecting the dots literally of the lines that I drew around the pattern and filling in those dots, figuring out what piece it is, and then we're just doing this for all of the different pieces as we go. I always get really nervous about sleeves because I'm terrible at figuring out sleeves angles by myself, so I really carefully traced the sleeves. But by the end I got just really tired of tracing pattern pieces, so I got a little sloppy on a couple pieces, so we'll see if it comes back to bite me in the butt later, but I don't think it will. There was also something really interesting that I noticed as I was tracing, in that modern patterns have like arrows that say cut on fold. But in these patterns, they actually had a series of cutout circles that indicate that the pattern piece is supposed to be traced on the fold. So then I had to go back and look at all of the different pattern pieces that I had already traced and make sure that I noted where those were supposed to go on the fold, which was kind of cool that they thought of a sort of secret code to figure that out in a pattern before they were able to print. I think that's kind of a cool historical fact. If you look at the screen, you can see those three little triangle pieces that indicate this part of the collar is supposed to be placed on the fold. I was really unsure about that piece. I wasn't sure what was going on, and it was like really stressful trying to figure out if I was supposed to copy it once or twice or what was going on. And it's even pretty unclear in the pattern, so I'm anxious to see how that part turns out. So now we get to pretty much what was the most boring part for me, which was cutting out the skirt, because honestly, if you've cut out one skirt, you've cut out every skirt in existence. So yeah. And that is a beautiful, beautiful, sexy line drawing. I love this part of rebuilding patterns and like drawing those lines and connecting them. It's just always really satisfying when they like match up and you nail it. I don't know. There you go. It's 30 seconds of your life you'll never get back. All right, so now we're cutting out the actual new pieces of the pattern that I created on that paper so as to preserve, like I said earlier, the old pattern. And then all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, it starts sort of looking like a viable thing that might go on a human body. And so I put all the pieces together, just kind of see what I was looking at, and it is looking like, you know, every bodice in existence. So that is exciting. So, okay, this is where things get a little bit weird in this build process already, and we're only on day one, because I'm looking at these pattern pieces and they just look a lot larger than what the envelope says, which says that it's a bust 32, which is like a size 4-6. And I'm about a size 8, 10, 12 if we're being honest. And so I realized that I was going to have to size it up, but the more that I looked at these pattern pieces, the more I realized that this pattern seemed to be almost like a bust 42, 44. And I checked the back of the pattern envelope, and the pattern was originally produced all the way up to bust 44, because let us not forget that plus size is not a modern invention. And so I started measuring to figure out how wide across the front was, and then add that total to the back, and I got a total of 44 inches, which, like I said, is dramatically different from the measurement on the front of the envelope. So I decided that rather than start by sizing up the pattern right away, not sort of knowing how this pattern was supposed to come together and whether or not it was going to lose a lot of inches with like darts and pleating and that kind of thing, I decided that the best course of action was just to cut it out as is, make a mock-up of that, see how it fits, and then go from there, instead of just jumping right into resizing the pattern, which had been my original plan. Whether or not this all turns out to be a spectacular waste of time, we will find out later. So like I said, I decided just to cut it out as is, just to see what happens. And so I got some trash bag fabric and I cut it out, traced the pattern, cut it out, you know, construction, basic stuff, not very exciting. That's probably all we need to say about this part. Okay, so this next part is where I finally start feeling like a historical costume detective, because I realized that I did a bad job of transferring those punched dots to the fabric, and so I went back, I got out the pattern piece, and I traced it. And I noticed that on the pattern piece there were a lot more than I had originally noticed, just because it had been so wrinkled when I first took it out of the package. So I went through and I traced all of those onto my fabric. And as you can see with this part, there's different sizes as well. There's like a larger hole and a smaller hole, and then the original owner of the pattern cut in the little, you know, notches, and then there's a pattern number stamped in there. So there's a lot going on just with this sort of weird punch out technique. So then I started trying to put in the pleats and the darts as instructed. However, the problem was that I could not figure out which way the pleats were supposed to go, because the pattern says that you're supposed to take the small dot and match it to the big dot, and that's how you get your pleat. But the problem was that when I did that, it made this really weird shape in the garment, and I just was looking at it and I was like, this just cannot be right. And so I did the only thing that you can do in a time like this, and I looked at the picture on the front of the package. So I looked at the front of the package and it was just inconclusive, but it just didn't seem right at all. And so I was looking at it from the front and I just thought it looked really dumb and didn't look quite right. So I went to the instructions, and the instructions seemed to indicate that there were like 2 or 3 pleats. And so I ironed out what I had done and I started thinking about ways to fold it. And so basically what I realized is that if you took the large dots and you brought them to the small dots, instead of doing it small to large, then you could hypothetically get 3 pleats on either side, which pretty much matched the instruction diagram thingy, even though it didn't match the text instructions. So that's what I went with because I do what I want. So I redid the pleats, and after doing it that way, I was a lot happier with the way that it looked, which was awesome. So I redid the pleats in that technique, and I got 3, which matched the diagram, and then I checked to make sure that they were pointing in the right direction, and they were, because they matched the arm size as well. And then I did the same thing on the other side, facing the pleats in the other direction, so when you put it on, it looks nice. And then we were on to the next step, which was putting the darts in the back piece in order to make sure that the fit was right. Again, your computer isn't glitching out. I just sped up this video a lot, and my computer apparently saved this video exceptionally weird. During this project, you're going to see me ironing a lot, and it's because I have a gravity feed iron, which is a really, really useful tool for almost using it sort of like a sketch of where you want to pin. And what I use it for is to basically iron in the line that I'm going to sew, so I can double check and make sure that everything lines up and everything works the way that I want it to. And it's a technique that I learned in college, and I use it all the time. Started by sewing my darts, and then I just basically sewed the whole thing together, which didn't take too long at all. And then I realized that I had made a mistake, because there is a gather that needs to happen in order to make the front of the robe match with the back shoulders of the robe. And what you do is you gather between those 2 points that I just pointed out. So I sewed a long basting stitch across the top, which is just basically the biggest stitch that you have on your machine. And then I started gathering, which is one of my favorite things to do using this technique, which basically you just take the end of your stitch and you pull on it and the fabric gathers, and you don't have to do hardly any work at all, and it's super simple and super easy, and it always comes out looking really nice. And then I kind of futzed around with it a little bit because I'm like weird and picky about my gathers, but basically I got the shoulders to the right width, and then I put the whole thing back together again, and I ended up with what was basically a functioning garment. So since the purpose of building this mock-up was to test the fit, I realized that I also needed to sort of figure out a way to test how the collar was going to fall. And so what I wound up doing was just taking a minute to press that in, which worked honestly pretty well. And I was able to sort of see how the flaps were going to fall. And then I, wind up with this really kind of weirdly Edwardian looking garment to try on, and that is the next step. So I measured it first, and it wound up being, according to this, like right around the right size, which I still don't trust. So I started trying it on and checking out the fit. So this is just me vainly playing with it in the mirror for forever. But honestly, for something that on the package says that it's supposed to be at like 4 sizes too small, it's really close, which is really exciting because it means that I don't think I'm going to have to do nearly as much alterations as I thought I was going to, which is really, really cool. So I marked up a couple of places where I know that I'm going to have to change up the fit, because I have big old broad shoulders. But yeah, there's still a lot left to do. So I'll see you in part 2.